Okay, so hello everybody. We are in a small round, I think. I have to explain, maybe not to you, John Lough, but Mr. Heisbourg, to you, that we as Center for Liberal Modernity have since a year a project for the Foreign Ministry connecting the members of the Rada with German parliamentarians and connecting them with Brussels also, because our estimation was 200 new elected parliamentarians with no experience at all. It's quite a good ground to start working with each other. And being from the Green Party, having experienced that ourselves in 1983, we are even the best advisor you can have, because we had this experience in '83 also when the Green Party entered in Parliament. So we wanted to meet, of course, we wanted the members of Parliament to travel to Berlin, to Brussels. None of this happened because of Corona. Now we are all sitting at home. And we try to keep up our conversation via Zoom, like everybody does at the moment. And we do have pretty good connection now to the Foreign Committee in the Rada. It's good news that the speaker is very European, Western orientated. He does not belong to this part of Lough, which wants to go back east. And but he has Corona, so we are missing him today. But they had been asking for a debate, and I think you can see why, to a little bit explain what the French and the German are doing in negotiating with Kremlin, Germany, Nord Stream 2. Everybody knows the background of that debate and what it means for Ukraine. And of course, Mr. Macron, your president, with his rapprochement, which can make you a little nervous, at least if you don't have a good explanation what is in that box or in this reset button. So this is what we have an hour to talk about now. Lunch on without any lunch, maybe a cup of coffee on your tables. So John and you, Mr. Heisbourg, and I think we have met before, probably at the YES conference. Is that possible? Yeah, we know each other. Okay. So yes, we thought that you give us a little input. John has been working on a book, and I think you finished it, John.
I finished the first draft.
Okay, finished on the German-Russian relations. So he has been looking into the German soul a little bit. And Ralph and I have been trying to, well, explain and always dig a little deeper what is happening in those silly German brains who just can't let go of their romantic ideas that Moscow and Berlin belong to each other. So enough said from my side. John, and yes, I have to introduce you for a minute. John Lough, he's a good friend of ours. He has been working for TNKBP long time ago, and now is linked to Chatham House. So we have quite some connection. And Mr. Heisbourg, I now don't have the correct, is working with the IIS. And we have been meeting in the YES conference. So this means that you are knowledgeable about Ukraine and Eastern politics also. And since you are French, we want to hear from your side what your president is thinking and talking about when he's talking about rapprochement. Mm-hmm. So I think it would be wonderful, Mr. Heisbourg, if you would start. Sure. And then we give John.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for having invited me. It's a great pleasure. I haven't been back to Ukraine since the beginning of the war in 2014. I was in Kiev just at the very beginning of the little green men operating in the Donbass. So you give me the opportunity at least to go back to Kiev in virtual terms. And I also hope very much that the parliamentarians who have been hit by COVID will have a prompt return to health. It's a nasty pandemic, and we're going to have to live like this for some time, I'm afraid. First, a little bit of soul searching in France. There has been in the 20th century a soft spot for Russia in France. A soft spot linked to the alliance with Russia and Britain on the eve of the First World War. And this has left substantial memories. L'Alliance Franco-Russe, of course, this was more than 100 years ago, but you still have that kind of feeling. And of course, in the Second World War, notwithstanding the Stalin-Hitler Pact, the Soviet Union was seen as one of France's liberators in the Second World War. We still have a metro station called Stalingrad, probably one of the few places in the world which has not been called Volgograd. And you have had also during the immediate post-Cold War period, when Russia was down, if not out, you had a period during which there was little penalty and little risk to operate with Russia when there were reasons to do so, particularly at the time of the Iraq War, 2003, where Paris was the driving force of the No coalition, along with Berlin and Moscow. That was done. Then came the war in Georgia. Now, Georgia was not a turning point in terms of the relationship with Russia. The Russians, of course, behaved badly, but they were not seen as having behaved effectively. Russian military reform had not yet seriously kicked in, and the French found a useful role in terms of mediating between Moscow and Tbilisi. So here again, the French-Russian relationship was actually seen by just about everybody as having been a useful relationship. When Russian tanks were literally 65 kilometers away from Tbilisi, the fact that the French were in a position to broker a ceasefire came in pretty useful. Then 2009, Joe Biden comes to Munich shortly after the inauguration of Obama, and he gives his big speech on the reset. Reset is an English word, it's not a French word. Sarkozy took reset quite seriously and did a terrible deal. I was against it at the time, which was the sale of the Mistral force projection ships to Russia. Then 2014. 2014 is the turning point. That's very clear. The lodestone for the French in this affair, as in others, notably in the post-Cold War era, has been whatever we do let's try and do it with the Germans in the same way as we did vis-a-vis Bush in the Iraq War. Here we worked with the Germans on how to deal with the Russian aggression against Ukraine, both in the Crimea and in the Donbass. There was, when Germany decided, to the great surprise of the Russians, they were not amused. I was also in Moscow at that time, and Putin's advisors were not expecting the Germans to move the way they did, nor were they enchantés when they saw that the French and the Germans were operating together. And that is why you have EU sanctions, and why you continue to have EU sanctions, and why the sanctions are renewed continuously with actually rather little difficulty. This should not be forgotten, year after year after year after year. Then comes Macron. Macron was the object of a Russian disinformation smear campaign during his election, both in terms of info ops and in terms of cyber ops. And as you may remember, the manner in which he humiliated Putin at the big press conference in Versailles shortly after his inauguration, when to an unwise question from a representative of Russia Today, Macron answered and said, well, Russia Today and Sputnik were not invited to my campaign briefings because they are not part of the press. They are agents of influence. And actually, they're organs of influence. Sorry, he used the organ word, which, as you know, in Russian has a very specific meaning, and Macron knew what that meaning was, and obviously Putin did so too. So there was no particular love between Macron and Putin, but Macron believed that he could play the role of the horse whisperer, as he tried to do with Trump and as he tried to do with Erdogan. And so he tried to do with Putin. In the case of Trump, the failure of horse whispering was evident by April of 2018. So that lasted only a bit more than a year. In the case of Erdogan, it lasted just a little bit more. In the case of Putin, it went on until a new turning point in 2019. That's when Macron talks about rapprochement. He didn't use the reset word. And what drove Macron's rapprochement? And here's the interesting part. The rapprochement is not about Russia. It's about China. That is, Macron's reasoning was, our big problem in the fullness of time is the rise of China as the other superpower, along with the United States. Russia and China have he used the word strategic alliance, which is a misnomer, but that misnomer played a big role in Macron's analysis. They are in alliance. This is obviously not good for Europe, because we have Russia, which is obviously a problem, and we have China, which is the growing bigger problem. And therefore, it is in Europe's interest to detach Russia from China. The analysis, once again, was not Russia-driven, it was China-driven. And Macron imagined that he could achieve this by setting up his so-called strategic dialogue with Russia, including an arms control dimension, which in itself was actually not in itself a bad idea. Remember that at the time, Russia was violating the INF Treaty, but it's the Americans under Trump who decided to leave the treaty. And so giving the Russians the perfect pretext to get entirely rid of a treaty which Putin had never liked. Putin in Munich in 2007 had been very clear about the INF Treaty. But as he said, this is not that he was not happy with the treaty. So Macron had this belief, this analysis from which he drew a conclusion, but the reality principle then intervened. And Macron may make mistakes in his analysis, like we all do at some stage or another, but Macron does not ignore the reality principle. And what became fairly rapidly evident after a few months was that there was no acceptable progress in terms of the Ukrainian account, if I can call it that, and there was no progress on the arms control side of things either. By the beginning of this year, it was clear that this strategic dialogue was not happening. And the Navalny, the attempt to assassinate Navalny gave an excellent reason for Macron to be able to essentially pull the plug out of the dialogue by adjourning sine die the 2+2 meeting between the foreign ministers and the defense ministers of the two countries, which was supposed to have been held about a week after Navalny's poisoning. That is one dimension, Chinese dimension, I can put it that way. Now you have another dimension which has to be taken into account, which does not slot into the strategic dialogue category with Russia, but which will play a role in the coming months, possibly years, and that is the Turkish problem. As you all know, France has decided to support Greece and Cyprus, two fellow members of the European Union, threatened by Turkish policies in terms of territorial waters, maritime issues, energy issues, and so on. And of course, France also found herself at loggerheads with Turkey in Libya, on the one hand, and in Syria on the other, where France, like the US, had supported the local Kurds, who had played a major role and continue to play a major role in the fight against Daesh in Syria. And we found on our way our Turkish friends operating in a manner which was definitely not friendly. How does that mesh in with the Russian problem? Well, in the case of Libya, the Russians were on the same side as the French were. Well, Russia in this case meant Wagner. And when it became clear that the Turkish supported side in Libya was getting the upper hand, the Russians withdrew most of their assets from Libya, and the French became a bit more careful. There was we came very close to a naval clash close to Libyan waters when one of the Turkish ships painted one of the French frigates with its fire control radars. And of course, the crisis between the EU and Turkey is definitely not over. I add on to that the appearance of another conflict which heated up recently, which is the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, in which Turkey is supporting Azerbaijan, and where the French have a long-standing, close relationship with Armenia. We have a very large Armenian diaspora in France. About 400,000 Armenians came to France after the First World War, settled in, became extremely hardworking, and very deeply integrated members of the French Republic. But clearly on Nagorno-Karabakh, we were not going to be on the side of the Turks. And therefore the French and the Russians have tended to operate in consultation, in concert, along with the Americans, and more strangely with the Iranians. All of this, to cut a long story short and an unfinished story short, is that the French obviously have objective reasons to operate sometimes with Russia against what is perceived as a bigger evil. Think Syria, think Libya, think Nagorno-Karabakh. But the important thing, and notably vis-a-vis the events in Ukraine and close to Ukraine, is that if there had been illusions about strategic dialogue with Russia, I suspect that these have been cut down to size, in a way which is to some extent comparable to what happened to Joe Biden's reset. You try these things because you think that the alternative is not as good, and you end up by discovering that actually this does not work. To end, I said the lodestone for France is that we operate with Germany. We operate with Germany, obviously, in the Minsk group. We have been operating together on sanctions. We have been obviously helpful in terms of the EU providing financial support to an extent which no other foreign power, including the United States, has been able to match. And of course, there was also the negotiation of the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. So there we are. The French are probably more now in a realpolitik mode, in the good sense of the word, that is fewer illusions about what one can expect to get when one operates with the Russians. And when cooperation with the Russians may be useful, I'm thinking of Nagorno-Karabakh, this is not allowed to happen at the expense of other friends and partners.
Marie, you're muted. You need to unmute yourself, Marie.
Oh, I will unmute myself. Thank you. It was unbelievably interesting. It's really like playing. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. It's really like having a chess game in front of you, looking at the different figures. And I want to say it's not even immoral. It's not immoral to look which strategic places are leading where. Looking to China and taking China serious definitely is in the interest of all of us in Europe, I guess. Maybe Germany is a country that underestimates the role of China. So I think for our friends in the Rada, and I see somebody driving there and listening, it is very, very important to get this background for us in Germany too, because very often we are asked in Germany, what's going on with you and why has Angela Merkel become less outspoken than she was, and Mr. Putin And I have to admit, I always say she can't walk all alone. If she doesn't have Macron behind her, she will make a fool out of herself, because Mr. Putin immediately will have understood that if she walks alone, then she's lost. Yeah. So thank you very much. And wait, maybe one more remark. Actually, I was expecting you to say, well, and also Macron has elections ahead of him, and he has Le Pen. And the right wing in France, from what I understand, are just as friendly towards Putin as our right wings are in Germany. Plus the left wings also. So I always thought maybe there is also a reason for Macron looking at his electorate, but you did not mention it until now. Maybe we could, yeah, okay. Then it will be your turn, John. Mr. Heisbourg. Yes.
Yeah, just to react on that. First of all, your reminder is absolutely appropriate. I mean, you are right. The extreme right is pro-Russian, including for financial reasons, the $9 million loan, etc., to Le Pen. The right wing of the right, of the mainstream right, is also historically pro-Russian for the reason I indicated earlier on. You know, the Alliance Franco-Russe plus a factor which I didn't mention, which is the Orient, the Christians of Syria, the Christians of Lebanon, Russia has a friendly eye on them, and so do the French. And for those people who are religiously motivated, that may be a factor. That being said, it's not a big deal in the French election. Nobody expects to get anything from Putin, and in opinion poll terms, France is the country west of the Oder, where public opinion is the most hostile to Putin. Public opinion, people who vote. Elite opinion is more pro-Russian than popular opinion.
Ah, yeah, interesting. I think it's the other way around in Germany. Okay.
You will not see people demonstrating in the street to support Putin. Yeah. Never happened. Yeah. Even if the heads of the extreme right or the right wing of the mainstream right, or if Monsieur Mélenchon say nice things about Putin, you will never see somebody walking around with a placard saying "Vive Putin," "À bas l'Amérique," or stuff like that. So little electoral impact, and where there is an electoral impact, it's actually a very different nature. It's the one I mentioned about Armenia. The Armenian electorate in France is probably the only American-style ethnic lobby that we have in political terms. That is, the Armenian community comes to a political position, they can swing about 40 legislative elections. Because they're located where they are, and everybody loves the Armenians. I mean, it's I do too, by the way. So what you will see is Macron, like his predecessors, between now and 2022. For example, next April, for the Armenian Genocide Commemoration Day. There you will see some serious extension of hands towards the Armenian community. And if that means doing a bit of a dance with Putin because he would be on the same side, yes, that you could see. But it would not be because of Putin, it would be because of the Armenians.
Mr. Heisbourg, thank you. John. It's very interesting. It's really like a lecture, and please give the second part, your British view on us silly Germans. Okay.
Well, thank you for that kind invitation, Marie. Fascinating analysis, Francois. Well, as I see it from outside, because I'm neither a German nor a Russian, just by way of background, in the 1990s, in the mid-1990s, I was a NATO representative in Russia. I opened NATO's first office in Moscow in 1995. And I spent 1 year based at the French embassy in Moscow and 2 years based at the German embassy. This was, in fact, very insightful because I saw the differences between the French cultural approach, if you like, to Russia and the German approach. In the case of Germany, this is a special relationship with Russia, and it reaches far back into history to the days of Peter the Great and his successors, notably Catherine. The Germans were the ultimate insiders in the Russian system. They played a significant role in the development of Russia's administration, its military system, its education system, its healthcare system. And Germans had enormous impact on Russian culture. Russia's role in defeating Napoleon had a very strong impact, of course, on Prussia, and Prussia and Russia began to cooperate in the late 18th century with the first partition of Poland. So there is this long tradition. And I would say as part of that tradition, there is something we see today in Germany, which is a combination of both sympathy for Russia, some kind of understanding of Russia and its complexity, and also a fear of Russia and it's the chaos that it can create in Europe. And what happened in Ukraine in 2014 was just the sort of latest indication of that. In the period between World War I and World War II, Germany and Soviet Russia were the two outcasts in Europe. The Bolshevik Revolution had an amazing fascination for German intellectuals. There was a belief that Russia was the country of the future and that Germany's future was in partnership with Russia. So one could talk about the history for a long time, but I think the important point here is that in short, when we consider the tragedies of the Second World War and Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, Germans and Russians have experienced both peaceful relations and extreme conflict. They've experienced closeness and hostility. And this explains, to my mind, at least from the German side, some of this ambivalence about Russia. Both countries prone to romanticism, and Germany has great enthusiasm for the Russian soul, Russkaya dusha. And the great irony is that this Russian soul that Germans so admire is in fact a German export to Russia that arrived in Russia in the early to mid 19th century. So there's something that very close that binds Germans and Russians. If you look at the history of economic relations, not much has changed over 100 years. Russia exports raw materials in return for high quality finished goods. The German company Siemens began working in Russia in the mid-19th century. And this economic relationship, Russia today exports gas rather than grain, as it did 100 years ago. But that sense of complementarity for Germany is still there, that Russia supplies the raw materials and we enjoy access to the Russian market for our goods. I would say also that since probably 1815, there's been a belief, I suspect, Francois, both in France and among Germans, that Russia must be at the table to manage European security together with other powers. So there's this very strong, I think, default setting in Germany that Europe is only complete when Russia is included. And the default setting for Germans is that we must avoid conflict with Russia. And this is far more than just about the historical guilt related to World War II. It goes deep into the national psyche. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reunification of Germany, Germany worked extremely hard to find ways of including Russia. Its policies under different chancellors, under Kohl, Schröder, and then Merkel, were very, very consistent. It did everything to build the maximum number of contacts with Russia, to make Russia feel that it was included, it was part of Europe. Yet at the same time, I would say from really the 1993 onwards, there were clear signs that Russia was not on the path of development that Germany wanted it to be. Berlin, in my view, deceived itself into thinking that developing business ties, for example, with Russia would improve rule of law in Russia. It then felt comforted when Putin came to power, a German-speaking president with a sympathy for Germany. And in the early 2000s, German diplomats spoke of relations being the best for a century between Germany and Russia. Yet Russia was also already moving quite clearly in a direction that Germany did not feel comfortable about, but couldn't admit. And as time went on, Russia was very clearly on a path of de-modernization and showing that it intended to restore its influence in a zone of what it called privileged interests. So when Dmitry Medvedev moved to the Kremlin in 2008, Germans and German policymakers started to believe that he really could be the man of the future and that Germany must invest effort in him. And Angela Merkel was also part of that. So the events of 2008 were very quickly sort of glossed over and back to business as usual, feeling that this was just a blip, that President Saakashvili of Georgia had behaved irresponsibly, and that we would, Germany and Russia, Germany and Europe would get over this quickly. 2014 saw a very sharp shift in German policy towards Russia. I think Germans were shocked, they were dismayed, they were offended by the annexation of Crimea. And there's a historical factor here too, of course, because Germans have great sensitivity to the violation of a country's territorial integrity, and they attach great importance to the observance of international law. But I would say that Angela Merkel deserves great credit for what she did in 2014, for overcoming the instincts of German diplomacy, which are always to avoid conflict, to focus on dialogue and on reducing tensions. Instead, Merkel took this strong moral stand, and the pursuit of sanctions and European sanctions was really very impressive, and I think totally unexpected by the Russian side. Merkel was helped in doing this by her East German background. I think her instinctive understanding of the Putin system, and indeed of the psychology of President Putin himself with his KGB background. So to lead this Western response to Russian aggression against Ukraine, I think was a huge achievement. There was a lot of weight on German shoulders. The Americans took a back seat and made it very clear that Europe needed to lead, and Merkel did that. However, there were very clear limitations. Firstly, the Normandy process. The UK was absent for its own reasons from the diplomacy to try to stabilize the situation in Ukraine and find a solution. So that was a factor. I think without the Americans there, Germany and France together didn't have enough teeth to deal with this problem. Putin also put psychological pressure on the German side to one extent in February 2015. In fact, forcing Merkel and Hollande to rush to Moscow because they feared that we were going to see a dramatic escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. And Merkel was worried that the Americans would then feel the need to supply lethal military aid to Ukraine. And unusually, because she's very calm in these situations normally, I think she lost her calm a little bit then. And we ended up with a terrible agreement, in my view, the Minsk II agreement. The other evidence of limitation is Nord Stream 2. Merkel is not and was not and is not a supporter of this project, but she also did not oppose it as one might possibly have hoped. And the reason for that is because of a split within her own party, as well as the support from the old Social Democrats of Gerhard Schröder and Sigmar Gabriel, the former foreign minister. And you could really see some evidence here of the Russian networks of influence in Germany. But this possibly coincided with a view deep in the German foreign ministry and other parts of the government that we need to have some sort of cooperation with Russia. We need to try to be able to move forward, to have another insurance policy. And in a way, I sometimes think this policy of having the new pipeline sort of makes Germans almost calm down themselves, that we can manage this with Russia. We're going to cope. We have our interests. They want to export their gas. We want to buy their gas. We'll have another physical connection. And in this environment of, if you like, of alienation, I think this was possibly quite important. But notably, I think the German diplomats were very smart and Merkel here succeeded in putting her, if you like, new Russia policy into an established tradition of what we had even in the 1960s with the Soviet Union, this tradition of deterrence and dialogue, the so-called Hamel doctrine at NATO. 2014 definitely revealed a lack of knowledge in Germany about Ukraine.
John?
Yeah.
We have something like 15 minutes left. I don't know about audience, which is has to be very patient, although both of you are really wonderful to listen to. Maybe you rush and then...
I'm nearly finished, Mary.
Is there any questions, Mattia? Is there anybody raising their hands?
Not yet, but...
Not yet. Okay, so I give you a few more minutes, but then...
I'll be very quick.
Okay.
Yeah, I've
Okay.
really two more points to make. So I was saying that I think in 2014 we saw the events in Ukraine revealed a lack of knowledge in Germany about Ukraine. And this has something to do with the period after 1945, when Moscow wrote its version of history, and how effectively it was Russians who had been the victims of German aggression, forgetting, of course, about Ukrainians and Belarusians who bore the brunt of the German attack. And as a result, there are very few specialists on Ukraine in Germany, particularly in the academic world and the think tank world. And there weren't so many of them in government either. And Germany has its biggest bilateral embassy in the world in Moscow. But the diplomatic presence in Ukraine in terms of what I would call senior diplomats was rather limited, given the size of the country. The Merkel policy held. Okay, Marieluise?
Yes, I think I want to step in for a second.
Yeah, go on.
Number one, just a short remark, since you mentioned Minsk and the terrible outcome. I know that this was really due to the fact, and Ukrainians know it, that Poroshenko actually was in a huge and dramatic trap, because there was 2,000 soldiers encircled in the Balzovo. And Merkel, she said afterwards that Hollande and her were ready to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and leave. But Poroshenko, having no space to maneuver, knowing that those 2,000 people would be killed by Russian military. This was the surrounding and the reason for this terrible Minsk you're talking about. One thing which I think is really interesting, that none of you were talking about the United States. And I think what you would have to add, at least talking about Germany, and if I know a little bit about France also, de Gaulle withdrawing from the political part of NATO, I think in Germany, you always have this facet that when you were talking about German romantic feeling culture, that this anti-Western, to make a long story short, which is anti-parliamentarian, anti-materialistic, anti-parliamentarian. You have a lot of antis in the German thinking and soul, which boils down to being anti-Western and anti-American, anti-Semitic, of course, also. And Russia then was the other side to turn to on our continent, being a European people, which is much closer to our culture, our deep soul, than those funny Americans with their chewing gum and not even using the knife correctly, but cutting the meat first, then putting the knife on the plate, and then taking the fork in the right hand. This is stuff which I learned in my family. You know, this was, you know, they were not cultural, not civilized beings, the Americans. And when I'm very nasty, I say, well, Germany has not forgot that if the goddamn Americans hadn't stepped in twice, we wouldn't have lost both those terrible wars. So this anti-Americanism, I think, is one facet, which at least if you talk about Germany, you have to talk about. And it is very deep. It is very deep in our society. And Mr. Heisbourg, if you say the elites are different towards Russia, being less critical than the population is, I think you can say in Germany, it's just the other way around. Just the other way around. Everybody, and also Mrs. Merkel she has to know that, and it's her fraction members telling her, if you keep squeezing Putin, we will pay for it in our constituencies. And we will lose people in former times going to the left. Now they even have a better offer going to the right. And this is really weakening the German politics. Yes, so is there anybody raising their hands, Mattia?
You can, yes, I'm looking at the audience, the many are just muted, so just either use your virtual hands or unmute yourself while we're waiting for you. I have one question, which I think is burning under the Ukrainian parliamentarians' fingernails, thank you, which is basically, we heard about the special relationships, in plural, from France and Germany with Russia, and how should Ukraine knowing what you now said, utilize this. So from a Ukrainian perspective, knowing the special German relationship, knowing this desire from the French to get Russia away from China, what should Ukrainian parliamentarians and the foreign ministry do? How to navigate it?
Okay, Mattia, if I may add before you answer, Mr. Heisbourg, one more little scenery. I remember having a meeting of the Foreign Committee, German Bundestag, and the Foreign Committee of the French Parliament. And there, and it was close to 2014, maybe it was even 2014. And there we were really astonished that a lot of French parliamentarians, we never should have started all this deal with drawing Ukraine towards the West in the first place. EU should have known that Putin never would have accepted it. We should have asked Putin before that. That was a very strong voice with almost all French fractions in the Foreign Committee. So that is very interesting and of course important for the Rada members who within Normandy for that format have a little bit their fate in the German-French hands.
Mm. Yeah, I'm going to be very blunt for a moment. Macron's analysis, as he explained it on television, I mean, nothing of what I said about China and Russia is inside information. It's the way Macron himself explained it. If it had been possible to detach Russia from China by making European concessions to Russia, including at the expense of neighboring countries, I have little doubt that we would have done so. But as it happens, the relationship between China and Russia is not dependent on European policies. They developed their strategic partnership for reasons which have very little to do with European policies or European strategic calculations. And that is what it took a little bit of time for Macron to actually understand. It is unclear to me how Macron came to this strategic analysis, but the fact is that he did. And here we are, nearly a year and a half later, and he has nothing to show for this analysis. And when he spoke again about this at the Munich Security Conference this year, one of the very last pre-COVID international meetings where people were actually physically present, I had a little discussion with him. I can't tell you what he said, but I think he did listen when I told him that he may not have entirely convinced people about his so-called China calculation.
I remember him talking on the stage and saying, well, these sanctions don't work, but okay, if you still want them, go ahead. That was really terrible, what he said on the stage in the Munich conference.
No, I mean, honestly, it would have been much worse if he had done the opposite. That is to discard the sanctions. Sanctions are actually important, and I think he knows that. What you encountered with the Foreign Affairs Committee of the French Parliament, yes, this is what I call elite opinion. The list of French parliamentarians who are Putin versteers is relatively well known. There are links of various natures with Russian-affiliated financial and lobbying groups is also known. But none of these guys are dependent on Putin's vote for their own political future. The electorate actually is not going to be moved one way or another because they express sympathy for Putin. So I started off blunt, but I actually finish in a reassuring mode. That's not that in electoral terms, in popular opinion terms, the Russians actually have very little traction in France.
Well, that's good news for our friends in Ukraine, I think. John, do you want to add also?
Yeah, I'll try and just add one point. It seems to me that Ukraine has an opportunity at the moment to maybe talk more openly with Germany, because the relationship between Berlin and Moscow has deteriorated very badly this year. And it's been an accumulation of things. And the latest thing, of course, was the Navalny poisoning. Mm. And while Putin recognizes that Angela Merkel is not going to be around for that much longer, it seems to me that the relationship is not going to improve quickly, because Germany's facing certain realities now about Russia, which it previously denied. And it seems to me has accepted or started to accept that it's dealing with a criminalized Russian state. And the Navalny poisoning was the evidence of that. And then the cyber attacks on the Bundestag, on the parliament, the murder in the Tiergarten, all these things have added up. Now, up to now, Berlin has taken the view that Russia is key to resolving the conflict in Donbass. Mm. I wonder if it really believes that now to the same degree, because I am sure that with the current regime in Moscow, we are going to make no progress in Donbass, none at all. This is just going to continue as we are. And what I would like to see in Berlin is greater recognition of the fact that the reform effort in Ukraine and the changes that are currently happening in Ukrainian society, with all their problems, which we know very, very well, these are in fact key for the future of Russia. And I would like Ukrainian parliamentarians, among others, to explain this to their counterparts in Berlin with greater conviction. That I would like to ultimately to see Germany putting much more effort into supporting the reform effort in Ukraine. And that message has to come from, I think, Ukrainians, that here is the opportunity. If we can make a difference in Ukraine, this is going to have a long-term positive effect on Russia.
John, thank you very much. Maybe a little advertise, which I want to make, if there's German people listen. There has the ambassador who has been in Moscow for the last years, he now published a book, his experiences. You show it, yes. I think, yes. And it's very interesting to read. I think he is still from the Genscher time. He writes when, as a young ambassador, he was working together with Genscher. And his background is coming from a Baltic state, his family now Baltic state. And he is very firm and he has always been very firm towards the foreign ministry and towards the Russian politics. And when you read his book, what he does is tells us that the Russian propaganda, that there is no dialogue, which is being used in Germany very often with the so-called Putin-Versteher, that this is wrong, and that there is no country where there is so many efforts trying to reach out like to Russia, with students having the chance to study in Germany, with telephone calls between Angela Merkel and Putin personally, with the Petersburg dialogue, with the committees going back and forth, with cities having partnership and so on. So one of the propaganda rumors, which Russia has been spreading very successfully, is there was no dialogue and you must keep us in a dialogue and we German must stick to the dialogue because otherwise we are going to lose Russia. It is, Mr. von Fritzsche never would say so, I say bullshit. And the second very important propaganda they are working with is this, that we have encircled and betrayed Kremlin with expanding NATO, which is a propaganda also. Taking Minsk, I think the problem is it is like a bicycle. Everybody knows if you quit paddling, it will immediately fall down. And since we don't have anything but no other negotiation at the moment, everybody keeps on paddling this goddamn Minsk bicycle because they don't want it to fall over, and then what would be then? So this is a big problem which we have, and I think, John, you are totally right. It is, of course, also up to the Ukrainian colleagues from RADA to tell us German that it is not only something morally which we do for Ukraine, but that it is our interest, because the key for the development of a democratic Russia is at the time in Ukraine and maybe Belarus. We have to understand that it is about a key which we need, because if we want a peaceful neighbor, and if we don't mafia digging deeper and deeper in our economy, then we need a stable Ukraine. If Putin gets it back, we are going to have a problem. And that this economic challenge has really happened is we see now with Wirecard, because all the signs are very getting very clear that obviously the Wirecard enterprise was steered from Russia in order to get a hand and possibilities for the international finance market. So we do have good reasons, and I look at the RADA side, which is not so present at the moment, but still your two lectures, I think, are a wonderful basis. And the good side of online formats is that they last. They are not gone with your speech and your lecture, because we will provide our colleagues in RADA on the level of staff members and for the parliamentarians. And I think it is very useful to understand each other. And I have to say, Mr. Heisbourg, it gave me some hope, because I did not know that Macron has started getting and accepting this lecture of reality. And if we now have this new situation with Biden in the States, Trump being gone, Macron having understood, and Angela Merkel still there, I think this is pretty good news for Ukraine. And I hope that you guys in Ukraine and your president will use this good new strategic situation which has come about and bring your share. I think now we have to go and get some lunch, since we don't get it in the internet. So thank you both very much. It was totally interesting. Thank you. I hope we see each other again someday. It definitely will be offline again. And then we will eat and drink.
Yeah.
So
let's meet in Kiev.
Yes,
let's meet
good
in
idea.
Ukraine.
Good kitchen. And Mattia knows all the good restaurants there, I can tell you.